Today we're going to learn about genetics, and we're going to get specifically into things like Punnett squares and genotypes and phenotypes and all that sort of stuff. You learned about DNA, you learned about traits and alleles, and now we're going to actually figure out how traits get passed on to offspring and things like what are the odds of traits being passed on. So, to begin with the notes here, exploring genetic possibilities in sexual reproduction, one of each chromosome is inherited from each parent. This means offspring has two copies or have two copies of each gene, one from each parent. So essentially you'll get one copy of, let's say, chromosome 3 from your mom and one copy of chromosome 3 for your dad. Both of those chromosomes have the same genes, but a different version of those genes. Okay, so different alleles, or the same alleles, but they can be different. And the interaction between those two genes will determine what trait you have. So the two alleles that you get from your parents that are on the chromosomes that you got from your parents, right? One from your dad, one from your mom, that combined together and the interactions between those alleles is going to determine what trait you end up having. So let's say, as an example, that tongue rolling, right? You get the allele for tongue rolling from your mom, and you don't get it from your dad. Okay, and let's say it's on, and I'm totally not right on this, but let's say it's on chromosome 5. So you get a copy of chromosome 5 from your mom, a copy of chromosome 5 from your dad. Your mom's has the gene for tongue rolling, and your dad has the gene for not tongue rolling, non-rolling. Well, because tongue rolling is a dominant trait, you're going to then be a tongue roller because of the gene you got from your mom, from that allele. So that's what we're looking at today, is studying the heredity of different traits by looking at the alleles that get passed on from parents to offspring. So like we said, the two copies of the gene alleles will determine what trait the offspring will have. So the example they show here is, let's say that this chromosome came from mom and this chromosome came from dad. So here's an allele for brown eyes from mom, and here's an allele for blue eyes from dad. And because the brown eyes is going to be dominant, as a result, this child will have browner eyes. Now, in all reality, this is actually something that shows some co-dominance or continuous variation. So it's not as simple for eye color, but that gives you the idea of the fact that both genes interact in order to give the trait. And you get a copy of the gene from your mom and from your dad, but they could be different, as it is here. So how do we determine what trait we end up having from the allele that we get from both parents, the allele? So if we get dominant and dominant from both parents for a trait, so it's a dominant trait, and we get the alleles for dominance in both, well then of course we'll have dominant. If you get dominant from one parent and recessive from the other for a gene, well then they'll again be dominant, because the dominant trait shows up no matter what if it's present. If we have dominant and recessive, again, it's going to be dominant. But if you get a recessive gene or allele from both parents, then that's all you've got is the recessive allele. So the recessive trait is going to show up. So as an example, if we were to talk about something like straight hairline, okay, a straight hairline is something that's a recessive trait as opposed to having a widow's peak. So if you get the trait for recessive hairline from both parents, from their chromosomes, right, from the genes that you receive from them, then you also will have a straight hairline. But if one of your parents passes on to you the trait for having a widow's peak, well then that's going to override the other gene or allele, and you'll end up having a widow's peak hairline. What's interesting is, let me pose it to you as a question. If you had two parents that had the dominant trait of a widow's peak, okay, so the pointed hairline, is it possible then for them to have a child that has a straight hairline? And the answer is yes, right? So if this is dad's traits over here, dominant recessive, and they would have a widow's peak, but they have one allele for the widow's peak and one for the straight hairline, but widow's peak shows up, and this is mom's. So she has a widow's peak because she has the dominant trait, but also has a recessive allele. Then both recessive alleles could get passed on from dad and from mom, resulting in a straight hairline for that child. But we're going to get more into this. If that was confusing, don't worry about it. We're going to get into it. So some terms we need to learn before we start studying this. One is genotype. Genotype is the two alleles of a gene the offspring has. So for example, capital R, little r, right? So that would be an example of a genotype. It's saying what alleles that offspring actually has inherited. It's very specific. We use two terms to talk about the genotype of offspring. We say homozygous, which means that both alleles are the same. So we actually have two cases of homozygous. We have homozygous dominant, which means that we have two of the dominant alleles. And then we have homozygous recessive, which means we have two of the recessive alleles. But homo means same, right? So when I say homozygous, I'm saying that both alleles are the same. Well, heterozygous means that the alleles are different. So this means that we have one dominant and one recessive allele. So if I have heterozygous, I don't have to actually say whether it's dominant or recessive because it's both, right? I've got one of the dominant trait and one of the recessive allele. So heterozygous is always going to end up showing the dominant trait. Whatever is dominant, that's what's going to show. In the same way, homozygous recessive is going to show the recessive trait, and homozygous dominant, of course, is going to show the dominant trait. When I talk about dominant versus recessive traits, it's all about how we phrase it, right? So if I go back to, let's say, widow's peak, and I say widow's peak is dominant, dominant trait, well, straight hairline is a recessive trait. It's two sides of the same coin. Okay, so if I say, you've got two heterozygous couples that are mating when it comes to widow's peak, right? What I'm saying is that both of the individuals that are mating are capital R, little r. They have both the dominant and the recessive allele. So now that we know these terms, we're going to go on and talk about phenotype. So phenotype is talking about the actual trait the offspring has. So it's not talking about the alleles, but it's saying what the person is. So it's saying, hey, they're a tongue roller, or they're a non-roller, or they have widow's peak, or they have a straight hairline. That's the phenotype. Now, this does not specify between if someone is homozygous dominant or heterozygous. So phenotype is about the traits, not about the alleles. Okay, so it leaves a little bit of mystery when we talk about the phenotype, which is the actual trait the offspring has. So again, a good example is tongue roller. If we have a tongue roller, we don't know, because tongue rolling is a dominant trait, we don't know if this individual is homozygous dominant, capital R, or if they're heterozygous, capital R, little r. Because either way, this person would be a tongue roller. What we do know is that this person is not homozygous recessive, little r, because then they wouldn't be able to roll their tongue. So what we're going to get into is Punnett squares. And Punnett squares is a type of diagram that actually shows the passing on of alleles to offspring. And the way that we can use this is we can predict the possible genotypes and phenotypes, because if we know genotypes, we know phenotypes of offspring for a specific trait. So what we do is we make one side for the dad and one side for the mom. Now this is, talking about peas, so kind of weird to talk about dad and mom because it's both at the same time, yes. You've got the stamen, and then you have the pistil, right? Female parts. But let's talk about this as being from the man. So I actually often like drawing a little sperm here to show that it's the trait that's in the gamete. So there's two possible versions of this allele that can go into the sperm. And then we've got two possible alleles that can go into the eggs. But actually it's the same allele for both. So if I have a capital Y, lowercase y, so dominant and recessive, and you can tell here that yellow peas is a dominant trait based on the fact that this is heterozygous and it's showing up as yellow. Well, when I have lowercase, and lowercase again shows recessive, so if I have little y, then it's showing up as green. So green is the recessive trait, while yellow is the dominant trait. So now if I take this sperm and this egg, well, then the offspring would have capital Y, lower y, so it'd be heterozygous. So this would be yellow, another heterozygous, capital Y, lowercase y. And all I'm doing is I'm just crisscrossing. Yeah, I'm just going, okay, this meets up with this. Here I've got little y, okay, and little y. So Here I have offspring that would be green because it has the 2 recessive alleles. So if I were to look at genotypes, what I have here for genotypes is 2 capital Y, lowercase y, and I have 2 lowercase y, lowercase y. In other words, I have 2 heterozygous, and I have 2 homozygous recessive. For phenotypes, I have 2 yellow and 2 green. So a further question I could ask on this is, what is the odds of offspring being based on a heterozygous yellow pea mating with a green pea plant? What are the odds of the offspring being yellow peed? And the answer is, of course, 50%, because I have 2 out of 4 that are yellow. The odds of it being green, again, are 50%, 2 out of 4. So I can look at phenotypes to figure out what the percent possibility is of having a certain trait. So let's try out an example of this. A non-tongue rolling mother mates with a heterozygous tongue rolling father. What are the possible genotypes and phenotypes of their offspring? So I have a non-tongue rolling mother, and we've already established that tongue rolling is a dominant trait. So if I take a look at the mom, I have, and here's the egg, little r, okay? So these are the 2 alleles that mom has. This is the only 2 that she can give, is recessive and recessive, because mom is not a tongue roller. Well, dad is heterozygous for tongue rolling. So that means that dad has a capital R, the tongue rolling allele, and a lowercase r, the non-tongue rolling allele. Now, is dad a tongue roller or a non-roller? Well, a tongue roller because he has the capital R dominant allele. So therefore, as a result, he's able to roll his tongue because capital R is dominant. All right, so now, what do we have for offspring? Well, capital R, little r, this would be a heterozygous, a homozygous recessive, and a homozygous recessive. So genotypes, what I have is I have 2 capital R, lowercase r, and I've got 2 little r. So I have 2 heterozygous, and I have 2 homozygous recessive. Phenotypes. Messy. I have 2 rollers and 2 non-rollers for traits. That's what I've got. So those are the possible genotypes and phenotypes for the offspring of what I could possibly have based on the 2 individuals that are mating. All right, let's try this one out. A father with attached earlobes mates with a mother with unattached earlobes. If the mother is homozygous dominant, predict the possible genotypes and phenotypes of offspring. So unattached earlobes are dominant based on the fact that mom is homozygous dominant. Why don't we use capital E for this, for earlobes? So mom is capital E, right? Homozygous dominant. And dad has attached earlobes. So he's lowercase e. He's homozygous recessive. Okay, so what do we have? Well, we have here capital E, lowercase e, right? Capital E, lowercase e. Here we have capital E, lowercase e. Here we have capital E, lowercase e. And here we have capital E, lowercase e. No matter what, we get the same exact offspring here. So for genotypes, no matter what, we get 4 capital E, lowercase e. So we get 4 heterozygous. So what do we have for phenotypes? Well, that's pretty simple. We've got 4 unattached earlobes. Attached unattached. Earlobes. So no matter what, it's going to be unattached for the offspring. So the odds of having a kid with unattached earlobes would be 100% here. Okay? So here's one more. Having a straight hairline is recessive. Okay, show how it would be possible for two parents with a widow's peak to have a child with a straight hairline. So first of all, I should ask, is it possible? Is it possible for two parents with a widow's peak to have a child with a straight hairline? What do you think? Okay, and let's try this. Why don't we use H? Or let's use W, I guess. W is tricky because the uppercase and lowercase is really similar, but we'll be careful here. So straight hairline is a recessive trait. Widow's peak is the dominant trait. So if I had two parents with a widow's peak, could they end up actually having a kid with a straight hairline? So what we need to have a kid that's lowercase w, lowercase w. So in order for us to get that, that means that both parents must have a lowercase w to give. So both parents would have to be heterozygous in order for this to happen. Now, if they were heterozygous, the parents would have the trait of actually having a widow's peak because they have the dominant trait, yeah, but they could actually give the non-dominant, the recessive trait to their children. So here's the kid right here, lowercase w, lowercase w. This is the kid that would have a straight hairline. Right there. This kid would be widow's peak. This kid is homozygous dominant. And this kid would have a widow's peak. So what do we have? Well, for genotypes, we have one W, capital W. We have one capital W, lowercase w, and, two, my bad, and one lowercase, lowercase. So I have one homozygous dominant. I have two heterozygous. And I have one homozygous recessive. For phenotypes, that means that I have three widow's peaks and one with a straight hairline. All right. Sex is an interesting one. It's actually determined by the chromosome itself that the offspring gets. So if the both chromosomes that the offspring receives are X chromosomes, then that means that the offspring will be female. But if it's an X chromosome and a Y chromosome, well, then that means that the offspring is going to be male. So now what's interesting about this is if we look at it, it's actually the male that determines the sex of the child, of the offspring, because they're the only ones that can actually pass on a Y chromosome. They can't pass on, like females can't pass on a Y chromosome because they simply don't have one. So if we take a look at this, the odds of having a female child, if we look at the mom, well, then the mom is XX, right? That's all they have is the X chromosomes, two X chromosomes, while the male has X and Y. Now, why is it called X and Y chromosomes? Well, these are like the chromatids. When it's a full chromosome, like the two chromatids together, it does look like an X for female, and for a male, it kind of looks like a Y when these two are somewhat together or whatever. You look at pictures of karyotypes, which is all the chromosomes laid out. This does look like a little tiny Y. So that's what we have there. So now let's look at the odds of having a female child. So if this is the male right here, and this is the female, then this child would be XX, this child would be XX, this child would be XY, and this child would be XY. So that means that I have a 50% odds of having a female child, which is right here. So if I look at the phenotypes, right, I have 2 females and I have 2 males. So the odds are 50%. Now, this is the funny thing, is it doesn't matter what has happened in the past, the odds are still 50%, like flipping a coin. So let's say that a couple has had 3 boys in a row. What's the next one going to be? Well, 50% chance it's another boy, 50% chance it's a girl, right? You can flip a coin and you can get tails or heads 3 times in a row, 4 times in a row, 5 times in a row. It happens. It's just variance. But it all depends on what chromosome is in the sperm. Is it the X chromosome or is it the Y chromosome? Okay, incomplete dominance. Incomplete dominance is when 2 different alleles are present at the same gene location, but neither is dominant. We're not going to get very into this, but there are some traits that have incomplete dominance, so both show up. So if I take a red snapdragon and a white snapdragon, then they actually have incomplete dominance and they end up as showing as pink. This is something that like eye color has some like incomplete dominance stuff going on. Other things have some incomplete dominance. So both kind of show up, right? They both show themselves somewhat. So one isn't completely dominant over the other, but instead it's kind of like this sharing thing of incomplete dominance instead. But we only are going to deal with traits in our discussions that are very clearly either dominant or recessive, which makes it a lot easier for us to discuss it. All right, that's it for today. Have a good one.